The speakers are Stacey and Gitz. Gitz is a Six of Gates as a P and Dene youth facilitator, educator, author, activist. His activism is focused on the environment and Indigenous rights, and his novel Secrets of the Stars has caught the attention of national and international media. Stacey is a Nuchanuth and Anishinaabe woman whose first activism experience was at 3 years old. Her activism is present within her classroom as a high school teacher and in her daily life. Her activism currently works towards supporting the underrepresented in the Okanagan and pushing for a safe world for all people. Stacey, if I could pass it over to you for your land acknowledgement.
I want to state that I am on the unceded traditional territory of the Saulks people. The Saulks people have made their home here since time immemorial. They have lived their lives guided by Chapik, by their elders, by ceremony, by the land they belong to. At no time have the Saulks people given up their rights to this land. Therefore, anybody sitting here who is not Saulks Okanagan is either a guest or an occupier. As such, it is our responsibility to assure that Saulks people have sovereignty over the land that they should never have lost sovereignty over, as well as assure that they can walk down the street safely every day instead of the violence that they experience. And we should not be simply doing land acknowledgements as a check mark. They should be a statement of action. Otherwise, people should not be saying them at all. And they have to recognize both the beauty and the horror of our history here.
Thank you, Stacey. So for ours, a recognition that we are on stolen land is not enough when the genocide we call history still continues today and is reinforced by the daily lives of those unaware. Residential schools only closed their last door in 1997, but the mentality of the residential schools lives on. White people imagine living in a place that not only normalizes genocide, but actively covers it up. We don't live here because a peaceful treaty was signed. We live here because white people before us brutally pushed their way in. This includes our current government, RCMP, and church. We need to acknowledge this and the harmful systems it brought with it before we can even attempt reconciliation. It is a privilege to not know that you are living in such a way that makes a genocidal reality seem like regular everyday life. I would still like to acknowledge that the stolen land I am speaking from is rightfully the home of the Blackfoot Nations and was forced to be the home of Treaty 7. So this land is the traditional territories of the Six of Gates Mississippi, where they practice their oral traditions as far back as existence goes. The Blackfoot Nations included are Siksika, Kainai, and Piikani. Treaty 7 was signed on September 22nd, 1877, in a brutally unethical way. This treaty was not upheld. Treaty 7 includes the Tsuut'ina Nation, the Stoney Nakoda Nations, and the Métis Nation of Region 3. So this space known as Calgary is rightfully and actually known as Mohkinstsis. And this leads me to my introduction. It's going to be very brief. Like I just said, in 1877, that's when the treaty was signed. Canada is only like 154 years old. Like these numbers in generational terms, like 2-3 generations ago when Canada was formed, 4, and continuing on, like when colonization first started 8 to 9 generations ago, that's not that long, and that's not that many people. And the point of this talk is that, 2 to 3, 4 generations ago, everybody was aware of what was happening. And now for some reason, for many reasons that we're going to talk about tonight, because of miseducation, an ongoing genocide is completely overlooked or mostly overlooked. And if it's not, we get caught up in things like cultural genocide or it was so long ago. But the last school closed in 1997. Like, to give some context, the show Friends had been on the air for like 3 or 4 years. Everyone here was alive, I'm fairly certain. The purposeful miseducation would lead you to believe that the genocide never happened, or it happened a long, long time ago and it wasn't that bad. And we've run into this miseducation so many times that it's almost indescribable that a genocide of this magnitude can just be hiding in plain sight, and that is the name of this event. So I'm going to get off your screen and I'm going to pass things over to Stacey and Gitz.
Gitz, do you want to start us off today, since I already talked, and I'll throw it to you and I'll build off of what you have to say, I am sure.
Yeah, I guess we can look at the history of Canada and trying to understand the focal points and the story that all the colonizers had told themselves before they came here. And that was that this was wildlands. The people that were here needed to be tamed. Generally, there's two main identities that they gave to the Indigenous folks here. The first one was more prevalent, which is that we were godless savages and that we didn't really know right from wrong and we were killing each other. And the second was cultivated afterwards, romanticized, was the noble savage, the one who was in tune with the earth, you know, talking, painting with all the colors of the wind, and generally just at peace with all things. Both of these are incredibly racist. They tend to look at Indigenous folks as static and not really, kind of like frozen in time. There's hardly ever any questions or conversations about how Indigenous folks were evolving. There's never any conversations or talks about the governance systems, the diverse governance systems that were across North America, Central America, and South America. It wasn't like a chief leading as a dictator. Like especially with the Six Gates people. We have societies, we had our own policing system, we had the very profound role of the woman that was respected. We weren't simplified. And when you simplify an entire nation or group of people, it's wrong.
Yeah, and I think building off the idea of women, Gitz, is that every nation that I visited, including my own, women were respected and we were a significant part of society. We walked beside our men, not behind our men, and our spirit brothers and sisters as well. And something that this false history, especially that of the noble peace with the land people being the glorified version of that, is that Indigenous women have been sexualized. We've been sexualized to the point where it's seen as our own fault when we go missing and are murdered and are raped. And I think that misrepresentation of who we are, not just who we were, but who we are as people, has led to the continued genocide. So I know we're going to talk a bit more about that after, but I think it's really important to recognize that this false history has damaged all of our people and has murdered our women and two-spirit people.
I think for myself, when I go back to that history, there's a lot of tells that when I hear a white person, a colonizer, a settler talk about Indigenous histories, there's things that they create that only exist in their imagination. And it's in the realm of this fantasy fiction, which is the state of the world or human evolution. And it's so funny when I hear you know, the Brett Weinstein fans or the Jordan Peterson pseudo fans, where they're like, before Indian people came here, there was a group of people that were living here, and then the Indians came here and then they killed everybody and then they took over. And there's no factual based evidence at all that these wars took place, aside from taking place inside of your minds. Like, and that's a tell. You believe that Indigenous folks over here committed genocide. And again, that perpetuates the idea of the godless savage without even knowing the people. some folks are going to get riled up, but it's like, do you even really know the name of your neighbors in your area that you're occupying? Do you really know their names? Do you know how to pronounce them properly? Do you know their history? Do you know who they are? Do you know their governance system, their nation building, nation to nation building, what they did? No, I already know that you don't know these things. Another way that they try to classify us wrongly is as nomadic, which is to me, or tribes. Well, these are two very problematic terms for me. The first we'll tackle would be tribes. Tribes generally has a negative, primitive connotation to the people that you place them on. They're just simple people. The tribal aspect, you're really seeing it now with the denial of science, the denial of like helping out one another, just sticking to one thought, and that's the anti-science, anti-COVID nonsense that's out there, creating these like false dichotomies of, you know, the secret men behind the curtain are poisoning everyone through these microchip infested vaccines, and we can just eat tons of ivermectin and monoclonal antibodies and getting enough sleep, all that Joe Rogan nonsense. That's tribalism. We weren't that. We were nations. We had a very diverse, a very specific, and a very complex way of governing and a very complex way of being. We were nations. And it's important to remember that, because tribes tends to dehumanize the people you're talking about. When it's nation, it's like, it's equal footing. With tribes, it's unequal. That means that the colonizers came here and they were like, they had something, they were more advanced, or they had, you know, enlightened minds. There's a negative connotation, and that needs to go. But that comes with Canada's history. There was tribes living here. And really quickly, I'll talk about the nomadic people, which means they're basically kind of wandering around and finding their food, and then just continuing on and to wander around aimlessly. And to me, that is so disrespectful. And there's so much untruth about that with our Indigenous folks, especially with Six of Gates people. We knew where we had different homes, but that we weren't nomadic. There's some rich folks out there that have like, they inherited their grandparents' home, or their parents have a cottage on the lake. If you live there during the summer, or maybe you're a snowbird and you go to the Mexico or wherever, I'm never going to say you're lost when you're going from one home to another. Like, I'm never going to say you're nomadic, because that doesn't make sense. You know where your home is. We had different homes throughout the year to match hunting. The Six of Gates people had the benefit of being pretty much the only nation in North America that had buffalo year round. But even then, you know, if we were going to go by a river or by a lake that had good fish, you could only go there for a certain amount of time. Then it would freeze. There's a certain place to go get berries. The berries don't last year round. So you, again, move. You wouldn't stay on the flat plains or the rolling plains during harsh winters. You'd retract back to the mountains. And we knew places to live. We knew places to go. There's a certain spot that is, they're doing some archaeology digs down in Waterton, and there's a specific area where there was a like a Vision Quest site. And these are the archaeologists saying this, not me, and they're all white. The way that the land is shaped is it pushes away the winds, and so this one specific area was used because it wasn't harsh with winds. However the land is structured creates some kind of vacuum that you could just sustainably stay there for 4 days and 4 nights to fast. That's just the intimate relationships with the lands. And we had these different spots all over Blackfoot territory. Nomadic plus tribal equals lesser people. So you need to let all that stuff go. And it's pretty cool when you actually get to know the nations and you get to start to hear about the governance structure and the governance system. The Six of Gates people in Mohkinstsis, Treaty 7, the Calgary area, which is like, for Blackfoot territory, it's everything south of the North Saskatchewan River, stretching into what we know as Saskatchewan, all the way down to the States. That was our territory, that was our lands. And the way we governed ourselves is completely different than the Lakota Dakota people, completely different than the Mohawk, Haudenosaunee, completely different than the Cheyenne. And then if you go over the mountains, and I'll pass this over to Stacey, it's completely different from her people as well.
Yeah, and this, I think one of the most destructive things that the Indian Act did and continues to do, which is part of our history and current current living is the exclusion of our traditional governance systems. You were talking about the idea of nations, and that's the thing, is every one of our nations had different governing systems that worked for our people, and they were very complex. I know people try to label them as communist, or they try to label them as democratic or whatever. Our governing systems don't fit into those boxes, and I think we really need to stop trying to put them in there, and people who are talking about our history and our governance systems need to stop trying to put us in those boxes. We are none of those. Those are all colonized forms of governance. And one of the things I would love to look at is this thing that a lot of people who are trying to be allies are really jumping on, is the idea of hereditary chiefs. So there are many nations over here, especially in the northern west coast, that have hereditary chiefs. And there is a complex system behind that. You don't just become a hereditary chief and you don't get to just keep that position because you've been put in that position. There's a lot of responsibility that comes with that. But not every nation had hereditary chiefs. Nations had chose their leaders in different ways. And since the idea of hereditary chiefs versus the Indian Act chiefs came out, what I'm hearing is a lot of people assuming that now all of our governance systems were the same. And by doing that, you're assuming that we are not separate nations, and we are, with our own cultures based on the land we come from. And we, again, it's a complex system. And I like that you brought up archaeology, because archaeology more and more is starting to show what we've said for our entire lives, and our ancestors have. Out on the West Coast, they found a aquaculture site that has been there for over 15,000 years. And my people have been practicing aquaculture since time immemorial. Like, that is immemorial. That is what existed for us. And again, it was a system of knowing the land that we're on. It was a system of respecting the land that we're on, because we're part of the land that we're on. But getting away from the idea that we are basically these hippies running around, like you said, with all the colors of the whatever that song is, that completely, we won't even get into that one. But and so our history is told incorrectly right from the get-go, even pre-colonization. And then it just continues to be told incorrectly. It continues to be told as a story that it is not. They talk about overhunting of the buffalo, for example, in your area and in Saskatchewan, and the buffalo were not overhunted. The buffalo were slaughtered. Like, they were killed alongside of all of the people that lived with the buffalo, the Blackfoot, the Cree over in Saskatchewan, and I know there's other nations. And the same happened with the smallpox blankets, right? And often in history, it's said, oh, it may have been purposeful, it may have not. No, it was purposeful. On Haida Gwaii, the blankets were brought over and they tried to eliminate the Haida people, not try to colonize, try to kill. And they were almost successful. Like, the population of Haida Gwaii dropped by something like 90%. I believe the same happened in Blackfoot territory with the smallpox. And when it's taught in the history books, and I am a history teacher, so I know this, when it's taught in the history books, it's not taught as a purposeful killing of our people and murdering of our people when they came over. So it starts with pre-concept, who we were as a people, and then continues with minimizing or minimalizing the violent nature of the colonization when they came over.
Yeah, there's one thing I wanted to touch on. There's a brilliant doctor named Dr. John Henrik Clark, who's passed away, I think, about 2 decades now. And he was a black Afro scholar. And I'm totally quoting him here. We lived socially, but we weren't socialists. We lived communally, but we weren't communists. We definitely didn't fit into the realm of Marxism. All of these things, and that's what he had said about his people when you look at the indigenous folks, the indigenous nations in Africa, and their different belief structures. For us here, it's almost the same thing. We have a different viewpoint that's unique. The idea of Eurocentric ideologies overtaking the world is when you try to apply like socialism to an indigenous nation. It's completely different. It's like it's way different. Our ways of Six of Gates to be are different than those over the mountains. Like it's just a different way of being, and we respect that. And the idea of like Marxism being something that's a close fit to indigenous folks, what I see, and again, I'm quoting John Henrik Clarke here, is most of these millennials who grasp onto Marxism that's closer to Groucho Marxism than it is to actual Marxism. And all of these systems, socialism, they were all like socialism, communism, Marxism were all in response to capitalism. These are all European ideas. We don't have to go to Europe to try to understand ourselves, to define ourselves. We go to our elders, and who are elders who are intimately connected to our ancestors, for us to understand who we are. Like we don't have to cross the ocean to bring their ideologies here. And if you keep doing that to other nations, you are carrying out this different wave of, you know, political colonialism, this Eurocentric ideology. You can't imagine something bigger and different than that. I have a problem. I even have a problem when people say like the Haudenosaunee or matrilineal society, because that the matriarch to me, with the confines of the structure of the Haudenosaunee, is it's too narrow. You know, when you begin to understand what language is, it's different. Our ways of being, our languages are alive and they're living and they're all encompassing and they're relational. When I hear matriarch, it's too small of an idea. What the Haudenosaunee have, is a lot greater than this small little definition, this ideology. So I just wanted to like piggyback off that. But when we go to like the extermination of the buffalo, that was 100% calculated. Carried off in the States first, and then carried on into you know, Canada afterwards. They understood that we were dependent on the buffalo, and so they began to slaughter them. You could take these train rides in the States, and then they had repeater rifles, and they would just stop whenever they saw a group of buffalo, and they would shoot them. Why it became so like easy to kill them was the same reason why you had millions and millions of buffalo in the area. When a predator would attack, would it be like, let's say it was a bunch of wolves, they would go and attack a buffalo and they would take one down. Or, and if the ones were running away, the other buffaloes would turn around and they would try to encircle. And they would create a barrier, a protection barrier. If one of theirs was wounded and they got away, it's the same thing. They would form this circle around. These buffaloes would form a circle around the one that was wounded. So when they would shoot these repeater rifles and these buffaloes would they would drop one, they would do the same thing. And then they would get, these other ones would start getting shot as well. They did this intentionally to starve us into submission, because they couldn't beat us during warfare. The warfare was costing way too much money, especially in the States. And Canada had known this, because you have to feed your soldiers, you have to arm your soldiers, you have to pay your soldiers day by day. If they get wounded, then you have to provide you know, allowance to their families when they go back home. And this is right after, you know, the North had fought to free the slaves. So financially, they were on the cusp of ruin, and that they thought was with their rifles and their horses and whatever else, they would just run over all the indigenous folks. That didn't happen. You had campaigns of genocide and slaughter that each of the presidents on Mount Rushmore all celebrated to indigenous folks, where they would, and this is the States, they would murder the village when the men had left to go hunt. They would kill the women, they would rape the women, they would burn the children alive. And then they would continue these. Men would come back, and the men would come back, and they would fight right to the death. Eventually, it all took form at the Battle of Little Bighorn with Custer, when they just completely annihilated all of them. Canada at this time was aware of what had happened, and they began to sign deals right away, massive land deals, specifically with the Blackfoots, because they didn't want us to get involved in that war. They didn't want us joining forces with the Lakota Dakota people. And then there was a treaties that came afterwards, because they wanted to renegotiate. And that kept us from those wars. But while the buffalo were being decimated, they kept allowing the fur traders to come in and kill the buffalo, even though we were trying to argue in the treaty, the peace agreements, not land surrenders. None of the numbered treaties were land surrenders. They were all peace agreements. we kept arguing for them to protect the buffalo. They kept saying, yeah, don't worry about it, don't worry about it. And when we signed the treaty in 1877, we thought we'd have at least 10 to 15 years left of buffalo, but they completely collapsed within the next year and a half. And that was all by design. This was all intentional and by design, because once we lost our food source, we became dependent on them. Just really quickly, that came from George Washington and his raids. His Haudenosaunee name is actually the village burner, because he would go in and he would burn villages. Native people would come back. Then he started burning all of their crops. They grow the three sisters, corn, beans, and squash. Once he burned those and they came back, they had nothing to live on. The Haudenosaunee are farmers. They're also hunters. Some of the most fucking beautiful, amazing, strong people I've ever met. But they were farmers. Once he got rid of their food systems, he realized that they began to crumble after. And then they carried out that by killing the buffalo here. So,
and then they move over the mountains, over this way. Of course, all of us along the West Coast were very late in regular contact with the colonizers. There were almost no treaties over here. There are still almost no treaties over here. There's been a couple in more recent years, but the numbered treaties, so Treaty 8 is up in northeastern BC, but on the West Coast, it took a long time to get here, and they did the same thing out here. So they stopped letting us fish. They stopped letting us be on the ocean. They stopped letting us gather our food. And again, it's all about food scarcity, right? And making a people starve. And again, use the smallpox. And they absolutely desecrated villages. A lot of us on the West Coast were primarily located in one village most of the year because of the weather, and things don't move around a lot on islands. So our villages tended to be in the same spot most of the year, and our fishers would go out for chunks of time, but they would always come back home. But I actually just watched a thing today in Northern California, and the same thing happened up here, where our people would be out fishing traditionally, and they were arrested for it. And this was like in the 1980s. This was not way, 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 way back. And so again, taking away food source and taking away ability to live in a way that we're not made dependent on a government to give us food rations that make us sick, food rations that have caused diabetes and obesity in our communities. And those people who have been able to be privileged enough to go back to our traditional diets are finding that the disease is going away. It's not existing in those communities. But yeah, that elimination of food source, and that continues if we look out in the Mi'kmaq territory, where the non-Indigenous fishermen have been allowed to destroy the Indigenous fishermen. So this is ongoing and continues. And I was just talking about the Mi'kmaq and how it's a continued thing where the non-Indigenous fishermen have been able to desecrate the Indigenous fishermen in Mi'kmaq territory even up till recently, which again gets rid of way of life and ability to be independent as people. There we go.
Yeah, I think that like most folks don't understand that it was designed. The starvation was by design, and celebrated by Prime Minister Johnny MacDonald, who talked about it several times, starving the Indigenous folks into submission and doing all they can to keep the Indigenous people starving. The ration system came in because once they moved us from our treaty lands onto reservations, which was a policy through the Indian Act. When we signed it, we wanted to live within Treaty 7. We never signed to live on treaties, we never signed to live on reservations. The policy and legislation came through the Indian Act to forcibly remove us onto reservations. While we were there, we couldn't leave. There was a pass system that was created. South Africa adopted it later on. But essentially what the ration system was either you listened 100% to what they would tell you, or they would just starve you. In our Blackfoot language, I think it's Wednesday or Thursday was ration day. And the ration day was when you would go get your food. And that's a part of our language. That's how much it affected us. And when I think about something like how they abused the system, the owner of the ration house would often solicit Indigenous women, young Indigenous women. He would sleep with them to get food. These rations that they provided us often had rotten meat. They really liked selling bacon. And when the bacon would go bad in transit, they would just resalt it and then give it to the Indigenous folks. And if you complained about your rations, then you got nothing else afterwards. Even the people who brokered the deals for the rations, those people themselves were cutting deals, and they would buy it for whatever, and then they would mark up the price and sell it to Canada because Canada was, giving us rations. But that in itself, like there was a whole economy that was based on our poverty that we even still see today. As for rations themselves, like there's a whole, James Jashik has a book called Clearing the Plains, and he really gets into the finer points. You can even watch a couple of YouTube talks about this. But the last thing I'll say about the rations is they had a work for rations program with Indigenous folks, which essentially is like slavery, because you'd work for food, you wouldn't work for money. And I know in my res Begunny, we had an actual allotted lands to live on, which is the res lands held in trust. And the Indian agent would say, well, you go build a fence over in this specific area. And if you didn't, then they would say okay, well, you're not getting your rations for the next week and a half. And mind you, the rations that we were getting were keeping us on the verge of starvation or starving. I talked to some of my aunties, and some of the older people actually remember days where they were younger, people dying of starvation, people being starved to death on the res. So the work for rations program like this, specifically on Begunny, there's a story where these men had to go build a big fenced off area. So they built it. And once the fence posts were in and the wire went up, the Indian agent said, okay, that land over there no longer is your reservation. That land actually belongs to a farmer. If you go on any reservation, and I don't know about this, about the northern peoples, but it's probably similar, but within the plains, if there are farms around reservations, there's like a 99% chance that they took more land from the Indigenous folks there because they used starvation. Now, the rations they gave to us, some of the food was rotten, and sometimes they would mix in the chemical lime within the flour that they had given us. So these were things that they used to poison and destroy us. When the sicknesses had come through, smallpox, influenzas, some of the time it came through naturally, because they come through, the first time smallpox hit us, it was through the Nez Perce, and the Nez Perce got smallpox from the colonizers. But we stole horses from the Nez Perce. The horses had the smallpox on them, and by the time we came back to our communities, we were all infected, and we died, and we infected the community itself. But then there was the actual purposeful trading that they would do with us, which is giving us blankets or giving us jars that people who had smallpox would cough in, and they would give that to us. Another thing that they would do is the Hudson Bay blankets. We valued them on the plains because winters are pretty cold, and a thick blanket would help to insulate your life. When we died, we would close our teepee rings off, our teepees, and then we would just get in a blanket, a Hudson's Bay blanket, and we'd put it over our heads and we would die. When the fur traders came through and the Hudson Bay folks came through, they would go into these teepees and they would find these Indigenous folks with a blanket on them. But the blankets were still in really good shape. So they would just take those blankets and then they would resell them to Indigenous folks. There's the insanity of diseases that had come through, and it was all planned. They knew what they were doing, and they carried it out. This wasn't something that happened through evolution or something that's naturally occurring. These were well planned out crimes that they had committed against us.
Absolutely. And those, I'm gonna do a really good segue here into that second question. And those purposeful policies and practices continue to go on into the current genocide. And I call it the current genocide, but it's really a genocide that just has not stopped since contact. while the Indian Act is still a policy in place, and yes, there's been amendments to get rid of a few things, but the Indian Act itself is a policy that continues to allow genocide to happen through eliminating our sovereignty over our own children. The way the Indian Act looks right now is if residential schools wanted to happen again, the Indian Act would support that. And I know people don't like to think the country has a current genocide happening, but it does. And if you look at what the UN's definition of genocide is, even there's 5 points, and you, as a country, have to have one example of one of the points, and we have multiple examples of all 5 of them. So the removal of our children, the death of our people, the improper healthcare, and the existence of that being able to continue, falling under this idea that we aren't our own people. We're still wards of the state if we are status, and if all of our brothers and sisters that are non-status have no protection as Indigenous people, including living off the land as they see fit. So there's a whole list of things I could go through as we talk about this mindset of what is genocide and how a genocide has or hasn't happened, or is or isn't happening. So I will pass it over to you, Gitz, to go off of whatever you would like to. With that, I just thought I should segue us into that second part.
No, it's great. I mean, you have these these shitty edgelords who will say like, "Oh, everything's genocide to you," but the actual definition of the one that came out of the United Nations was was from a man named Raphael Lemkin, and Lemkin himself had written several papers on the genocide, which he called the genocide of Indigenous folks in North America. This is prior to the definition that he had that came out of the UN. I bring this up because most people attribute the fact that Raphael Lemkin had lost family in the genocide of the Jewish folks in Germany and around Europe. That's what they thought he based it off of. But actually, prior to the World War II, he was working on and looking at the genocide of Indigenous folks in North America, Central America, South America, Australia, and New Zealand. And he was bringing all these different parallels together. A lot of what he based his idea of what genocide is was what happened to us here. So even the guy who was creating, one of the guys who had the blueprint for articles of genocide, he knew what was happening to us, and he definitely called it genocide. And it's weird that you have these shitty edgelords who try to put these different parameters to say like, oh, it's not, it's actually this, or it's actually this. And I find that the most liberal response is calling it cultural genocide, which is kind of true, mostly not. It's a comfortable thing that liberals say because they don't have to really do anything, really anything meaningful. That idea of cultural genocide is kind of saying, well, it's kind of sort of really, but not genocide, it's just something that kind of happened to your culture. It definitely fucking happened to us. And the mass graves that came out of the residential schools, the planned smallpox, the planned destruction of our buffalo, the murder to missing Indigenous women's, the MMIW report specifically outlines genocide being the police having an active role by allowing it to happen. You could even kind of stretch it out into saying the willful destruction of our economies is also genocide. When you cripple our economy before it has a chance to even grow, we put enough debilitating factors for people to evolve that can also be contributed to the people in poverty, which also has these socioeconomic problems. And this happens. This is all through the Indian Act. Child apprehension, that came from one of the policies in the Indian Act. Taking them to the residential schools, that was the Indian Act. Not having us the ability to have lawyers until the 60s, that was the Indian Act. Enfranchising, becoming a Canadian citizen, which a lot of soldiers did in World War I and World War II, got nothing. Some of those veterans were given lots of land. Indigenous folks weren't. We got shitty apartments in cities, and we got a stipend. Those veterans got stipends to live in those cities, and that was it. And the stipends could only afford living in like the ghetto areas. But that idea of genocide, it really is all that. It fits all of those parameters. You want to talk about like mass killings of people that happened in the schools, that happened prior to the residential schools. They did testing on us. They did testing on some of the youth and students throughout those schools, medical tests. My mom survived the residential schools. We talked about this, and she was there. She said when she was like 7 or 8, she had seen so much death, like actual death in her own dorms, that she would contemplate how she wanted to be found when they found her body. And I know there's people who are going to say, like, well, you know, everybody has that thought. It's like, well, I mean, if you share a dorm year round and they're just taking out bodies year round, that's going to affect your psyche. And these kids didn't die from, you know, this was planned. Some of these kids were murdered. The conditions that they were living under within the residential schools were reported. I can't remember his name. You might be able to jump in and say his name, but he actually had a report in the early 1900s about the living conditions and how they were. You froze during the winter and you baked during the summer, and the circulation of air was so bad that when one got sick, everybody got sick. But when there was a fire and it was just smoke, that smoke could kill and did kill massive amounts of children. You know, whole dorms of children dying or almost dying or being severely affected by this.
So and the malnutrition, right? It's like the malnutrition, that was all of these things, and that was in the report as well. And I can't for the life of me remember his name.
Dr. Bryce. Dr. Bryce.
Thank you, Dr. Bryce. Yes, Dr. Bryce was. He also reported on the malnutrition and how these conditions in and of themselves would cause mass death. Malnutrition made it almost impossible for these children to fight off anything because they were not being fed at a rate that he reported very, very small children not growing at a proper rate. And that was another big thing. And the government was told about this in this report. And oh, Gitz, you disappeared on me. And I don't have word for word the response, but the government's response was that basically the residential schools were still the best solution for eliminating the Indian problem. And so they were informed and they didn't care and they wanted it to continue. So if that is not allowing for murder, I'm not sure what is. It feels very weird to be here on my own, so I will keep going. But one of the things that we talked about was the child welfare system, and yes, the Indian Act is what made it possible for apprehension of our children, and no, not apprehension, abduction of our children, and our current funding policies continue to promote that kidnapping of our babies. There's more funding in most child welfare systems in this country. There's more funding given for the abduction of Indigenous children than non-Indigenous children. The next in line for funding is immigrant children. So the agencies get more money for taking children. They don't receive extra money when they put in support plans for families and increased funding for families, and a significant amount of our children are removed for poverty reasons. If there's no food in the house, or a parent can't get to work because they don't have a vehicle, and like if you live on a res that's not in the city, you're stuck there. Like there's no in and out. And there's things like this can end up in removal of children. Birth alerts that are apparently finally been made illegal in the last 6 months. Yes, that's right. In the last 6 months, they've made removing a baby at the hospital at birth. They finally made illegal.
Can you explain a bit about birth alerts are?
I can. So, and Manitoba has taken the main heat on this for good reason, but it happens everywhere. Birth alerts are when a person in the hospital, a nurse or a doctor or a care aide, decide that a parent is an at-risk parent before the child's born. And so they can call child and family services while the mother's in labor, and they are there at the birth of the child to remove the child from the family. This just was made illegal about 6 months ago. I might be a little bit off. It might have been a year ago, but it is recent that this was made illegal. And it continues to happen. And here's the thing that a lot of people might not think about when a child's taken away is that in order to get that child back, you have to be a better parent than the average human could ever imagine being. Because if you're doing one thing wrong, that can get written down and you don't get your child back. It could be that you have a beer and a social worker finds out about it. They can say, no, you can't have your child back. One of the more media covered birth alerts was when the Child and Family Services used the mother being intoxicated as a reason to remove the child. And the only reason she was intoxicated was because of the medication the doctor gave her after her birth. And so they're going to court now, but these are just the documented cases. And again, this happens everywhere. And once the child is removed from the home, that's it. And it doesn't matter if you have a lovely, caring foster family. You remove a child from their community, and it is again going into the world of what happened in residential schools, where our children are being removed. They're having a religion forced on them quite often, even in what we would consider friendly and loving foster care families. Religion is often pushed on the children, whether that's the parents' religion or not. And it is such a long road to get a child back. And again, like I said, you have to be a better parent than your average human could ever imagine being. You can't do anything wrong to get those child back. And when you think somewhere like Manitoba has 94% of their children in care are Indigenous, how can we not see that as the ongoing genocide? Here in BC, it's 60 some odd percent. I think in Alberta, it's above 50. And this starts with birth alerts, or again, like I said, it happens with poverty situations. There are some children that need to not be with their mother and father, but there's aunties and uncles and grandparents. There's communities that will take these children in, and we need to recognize that.
Yeah, if you were to ask my mom, she would take in every baby, you know. But the parameters so residential schools, it was taking all the kids that you possibly could. And some of the kids, some very lucky ones, were hidden. They were taken out into the trap line and they were hidden until, you know, they would come back after. After the residential schools, the policy of child abduction came the 60 scoop. And the 60 scoop had these very, very vague guidelines. So the idea that one of them is that the idea that maybe one of the parents was drinking, and not even like drunk, but perhaps they were drinking, you could take their child. If there wasn't quote unquote enough food in the cupboards or in and again, at the discretion of the person taking it, they would take the child. If there was the possibility of somebody being intoxicated around the child, the possibility of somebody, not even the parents, but somebody in communities where there's socioeconomic problems because of the traumas of residential schools, because the Indian Act has prevented economies from growing, exacerbating the idea or the problems of being poor, addictions. So even the threat, the possibility of somebody coming to the house, an uncle, a cousin, an auntie, a grandparent who may or may not be drunk, but the threat that actually might be there, they could take the child. This happened in the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, 2000s. The guidelines might have changed, but the 60s scoop has never stopped. There are more kids in care now than there ever was during the residential schools. Now think about that. Residential schools was every kid under the age of like 15 or 16 or 17. I'm getting mad here. 16 or 17, taking them to the school. That was every kid they can get their hands on, but there's more kids now in care than there ever has been.
Yeah, and I'd also like to point out is that up until quite recently, one of the reasons for removing a child, and by quite recently, I mean in my lifetime, people would have their children removed because they didn't speak English and they spoke their own language going to school because it was considered neglect. Or if they were living traditionally, if they were living off the land, there's not a lot of food in the fridge, or there may not be electricity. Some of us didn't have electricity all the time, but we were loved, we were cared for, we were fed, but it was considered neglect. And you could be taken into foster care from an amazing, beautiful home and still end up in foster care.
For people who loved you, that weren't actively trying to kill you or starve you, which is what happened when they went to residential schools. I wanted to talk really quickly about the birth alerts. So one of the, I worked on Vice. I worked with Vice on a series called Rise, in the episode of Winnipeg. Our director, unfortunately, was Michelle Latimer, who is very talented, but trash.
Yeah, should have been a little bit more honest about who she was. And then
yeah, I mean, she's talented. I'm not going to take anything from how talented she is, but the idea that she stole identity that wasn't really hers and claimed to be Indigenous when she wasn't is trash. Yeah. That's the exploitation of Indigenous folks, which is still happening today. But when we worked in Winnipeg, one of the things of the birth alerts was that a child may have been in care. A mother or a father might have been in care at one point in their lives, who aren't now, but they're having a child. That's a birth alert. That's enough for them to come and take your kid. Never mind if you transformed your life. Never mind that you might have came out and you have a successful job. There was one case we were involved with this family, and that was what happened. This girl was being abused in her family, and she decided I better check myself into care. So she did that to better her life. And then she aged out, and then she graduated, and she met this man, and they fell in love, and he works full time, and they had a 2-bedroom apartment. They were super excited. They had all the stuff ready for the child, like everything you can imagine for this kid to live, a good life. The birth alert happened, and they apprehended that child. Then they had to go to court for about 2 years. Then she was trying to actively do stuff to maintain some kind of connection with her child. They found out where the child was. This is one of the things that kind of messes me up more now that I have a daughter of my own. She, as a mother, was lactating, and so she would pump her milk, and she thought, well, if I can't be around my child could at least get the nourishment from me. So she would take her milk. She would, she'd pump herself. She would take her milk to where they had the child, and they would say, oh yeah, we'll give this to your child, right into the garbage. As soon as she was gone, they just threw it away because they were severing all ties that they had with her. Then they had to go into the court system to get the child back. And mind you, they did nothing wrong. They tried to say that she had an STD, or an STI rather, and she got tested for that. They tried to say that she was drunk and on drugs. She passed all these tests. Then they started saying that her husband was a violent offender. Not even true. No criminal record, nothing at all. There was no reason why they should have took that baby, but they did. The only reason why we heard about it is that he had money, they had money to hire lawyers to fight this in court. Our people who are in poverty don't have that option. So what are they told? They're pressured by the system. They're pressured by their lawyers. Just, let them have the child, and then instead of taking them to court, just prove that you're a good parent. This isn't like, once you have CFS in your life, it's not like they're here 1 week and they're gone the next. They literally invest within you a couple of years. Even after you get your child back, they're still going to bother you for a couple of years. There is money that they make on us, on every case that they open for us. The longer they have these cases open, the more money that they have. This is the economy that's based on our poverty that's still happening today. So if you look at even way back when they were giving us food rations, when they were, buying it at a discount and selling it to Canada, marking up the price, they made money way back then. They made the churches made money from apprehending children. The dentists who came to do teeth extractions, they made money. I had an auntie who had several of her teeth extracted as a child, didn't even need them extracted, but they extracted it anyways in the residential schools because that dentist got money. Child apprehension. The caseworkers get money and the foster parents get money. They get more money than we would have. But even stating that, having the opportunity to take care of our kids, we would all do that because we know how messed up the system is towards us.
Exactly. And I think another really important thing to look at is when we're talking about who's listed as an at-risk parent when it comes to any government organization. When you look at who are at-risk people, Indigenous people are listed. And so just by being Indigenous, up until 6 months ago, you could have your child removed because if you are Indigenous, you are at risk automatically. That's in the education system, that's in the healthcare system, that is in the child welfare system. All of those, being Indigenous means you're at risk. So it's this idea that, yes, our people have had trauma for generations. Now they're using the fact that that trauma was put on us to put more trauma on us. And so in the education system, there's a reason why Indigenous youth are listed. There's more money that comes in for them as well in the education system. Does it get used for them? Not sure. In my school they do, but in a lot of schools it doesn't happen that way. So it's this idea that we are automatically listed at risk means that they already have a check mark in the box to remove our children from us, even without birth alerts.
I just want to add to this. I'm a full-time student now, but when my child was born, we were both full-time workers, and she had a very traumatic birth. I was there, so it was something that was a shared experience. And we requested a counselor to talk about the experience of the birth because it was something that was super traumatic for both of us. And it was complicated. It was one of the, fortunately we had a really good surgeon that was there. And even with her, there was only another surgeon in town that could have saved, I'm really not making this up. Could have saved my partner, my baby's mama. So we requested to talk to a counselor about it because we need to debrief. Your medical first aid is super important, especially when you go into something crazy. What the hospital had sent us was Child and Family Services, and a caseworker came to our room and wanted us to voluntarily sign up with CFS. If I hadn't known any better and how vulturous these people are, this organization is, I'm not saying it's 100% bad, but there is these people who do use it for nefarious reasons, and it's a majority of the reasons why it's used on us. We would have just signed up if we were too if we were just so grief-stricken or we were still in that traumatic phase, we would have just signed out. Or if we were so young and naive, we would have signed out for this. But then we would have had CFS in our lives for the next few years. And we didn't even need that. We just needed to talk to a counselor about what happened. But that was the hospital. And that was to both of us who were full-time workers, who had a place for our child, who had everything ready for her to welcome her into the world. And that's how crazy it is towards us. They don't see human beings. They see this brown skin. They see the dollar signs that are attached with it. They see this unhealthy practice they've normalized, and they still perpetuate and carry that out on us even today.
Yeah. And I could go on for hours, Gitz, around Child and Family Services and how it has completely destroyed our people and continues to destroy our people. I wish there was an answer. Well, there is an answer, but if we look at what happened, it was at the Gitz a couple months ago. The Gitz up here in northern BC, they blocked Child and Family Services from entering the reserve to take a child. They said, no, you're not taking this child. It was like I cried when I read that. They just no more. I worry a lot around our urban Indigenous babies being born and youth who don't have connection to community as well.
And that was the community solution was the solution. That's the solution.
That is the solution.
You just stop them from taking your kids, and
yes,
they're going to violently apprehend your children. The response to match that isn't violence, although what people might consider that to be a violent act, it's self-defense. You're protecting your child. You're protecting the most sacred being in your own person's life. That's your child. That's your most sacred being. And there's nothing wrong with defending your child. There's nothing wrong with the community coming together to prevent this from happening, because the community is now reaching that very sacred place of sovereignty, of self-determination, saying, no, we're going to find our solutions. You are not the solution. This practice is not helpful, it's harmful. You know, the separation of a child from their parents and the parents from their children, and knowing you're not going to get them back for a couple of years, no matter what kind of life you have, that weighs on people to give up. And like she said, every little infraction that you do, they're going to use against you.
Absolutely. And that happens. Another thing around children going into foster care is there are some parents who have willingly given their children up to foster care because it's gotten a little bit better now with Jordan's principle, but it's still an issue, is that your child cannot get certain medical resources and educational resources funded unless they're in care. And so there are families that are like, I cannot provide the proper resources for my child, and the only option I've been given is to sign them over to care. And then it may be voluntary, but it's the same thing to get that child back. So people get convinced that the only way that their child will get the care that they need, or the wheelchair that they need, that isn't a piece of garbage that the poor child can't get around in, or the speech programs are another big one, right? The speech programs will not be covered under for a regular person. And so an Indigenous person who wants that for their child, so their child can speak, their nonverbal child has a communication device, I've been convinced and told that, well, they'll get it if you put them into care, and then you can just get them back and they'll have their device or their whatever it is that they need, have equal standing and equal opportunity in society. But it isn't that easy. They get the device, or they get the wheelchair, they get the prosthetic, or they get whatever it may be, and then they have to fight to get their child back and prove that they're not abusive when they were simply trying to do what they needed to do in order for their child to not have more barriers put up in the world.
This is coercion. Forcing us to take our kids.
Absolutely.
We're only talking about this one aspect of which is, like, for me, it is genocide. We're only talking about this one aspect of child apprehension. We haven't even talked about like housing crisis. We haven't talked about boiled water advisories. We haven't talked about any of these other things that we did not create. The system had created and put us in. Also not providing any solutions for these problems. I mean, you have the boiled water advisories alone. This isn't, we're not talking about connecting like communities that are, surrounded by, the mountains and you can't get to. Although if there was a pipeline you need to go through, they'll put a old pipeline through the mountains if they wanted. We're talking about getting like water, a human resource, a human right to people. We haven't even covered a lot of these other things, but when we say it's genocide, I understand what genocide is. I know what it means. I've done a lot of like research and reading on different forms of genocide. The give should be like the fact I'm actually telling you about the guy who was one of the people who created the definition of genocide. But if you look at like if you look at what happened to Jewish people, if you look at what happened with quote unquote the Gypsies, which is like a slur, if you look at the Hutu and the Tutsis, If you look at what happened to the Aborigine people, the Maori people, if you look what happened in Central and South America, the fact that they just wiped out whole indigenous islands full of indigenous folks, I know what genocide is. I am not trying to minimize what it is by saying what happened to us was genocide, and what's happening to us now is still genocide.
Yeah, and
we still have to live within the structure of the Indian Act. We still have to live within the structure of being second-class citizens through the Indian Act. And anytime any group of people have terms such as second-class citizen or are defined as anything but human, you start using dehumanizing language, calling them savages or drunken Indians or whatever, that's a mandate to kill them because you're dehumanizing them. And that's what it is. It's a mandate. That mandate is still upon us.
Yeah, and I was going to say, Gitz, I know the same thing when I talk about it being a genocide is the questions of me exaggerating or not understanding genocide. And it's sad that both of us have to do this at this point, but you have pointed out, Gitz, that you have studied this thoroughly. And as well, like I've traveled to Rwanda with the Genocide Institute to study and to talk with survivors of that genocide and really understand what happened there and understand reconciliation there, which is far beyond our own point of reconciliation. But I know that that's coming up soon that we're going to talk about. But yeah, like I do not throw the term genocide around all the time. I do not say everything is a genocide. We fall under how the UN defines genocide, 100%, in so many ways. And yeah, and I wish we could probably, I'm sure we'll talk again around things like the water crisis, which a lot think of the remote reserves as having the water crisis and not having drinkable water, boil water advisories, or do not consume advisories, which are even boiling it, you can't consume it. And a lot of people think of the isolated reserves, which do have that issue and it does need to be addressed, but it's also reserves that are right next to cities that don't have access to clean drinking water. I haven't checked the number recently, but last time I checked, it was over 100 reserves without clean drinking water. And there's also reserves that have partial clean drinking water, which are not listed under the government's clean drinking water site that they have. So if part of the reserve has clean drinking water, then it's not listed as a boil water advisory. Yeah, and the missing and murdered Indigenous women and Two Spirits is another thing that really needs to be addressed. Like I drove, my daughter lives out in Haida Gwaii, and I had to drive the Highway of Tears to get there. And I'm terrified, and I should not be terrified to go visit my daughter. Like that should not be in existence. And the problem is when you're driving through there, it's almost scarier to see an RCMP officer than to see a stranger, because I'm not convinced that the RCMP are not part of that. They have definitely not researched, or they have definitely not looked into all these missing women. But I'm not fully convinced that they're a safe person, not just a not paying attention person. So, and I am a woman with a full-time job and a somewhat reliable vehicle doing that. So if you imagine a young woman who doesn't have access to a vehicle, needs to get even 50 kilometers somewhere for a job or a medical appointment or to go see family, and they're at super high risk. There's no transportation up there. The cell phone towers that they supposedly put in, I can tell you right now, the cell service is blank almost all the way through the Highway of Tears. It doesn't work unless you're on one particular provider. So yeah, like that not being addressed and that not being looked at, the Picton farm not being listed as a mass murder of Indigenous women down in Port Coquitlam, near Vancouver, the fact that it's listed as a mass murder, but it's a mass killing of Indigenous women. and that was fully ignored. So the ignoring of these things happening frightens me more than that they are happening.
Yeah, I just want to also add that like any kind of language that's used to minimize a Holocaust or genocide disrespects the sacred dead. So if it is the Jewish folks and you're minimizing or denying the Holocaust that they went through, or any of these others, you are desecrating the sacred dead, especially for us here. All those children they're finding at the residential schools, you're desecrating them. And it's one of those things that they've normalized in Canada. It's one of those things that we can have an open debate about. But there is actually no open debate. There really shouldn't be one, because the proof is there, and we're seeing it come to light every day. I think we're over like 7,000 now bodies that have been uncovered in some of these schools, not all of the schools.
Yeah.
And these are just children. And that's like the craziest thing, is that people have normalized that the deaths of these Indigenous children.
Yeah.
We're doing nothing wrong, but just being children. And that, to me, is one of the major tells of Canadian culture that has to change.
100%. And I know I realized I'm really bad at following the chat, and Julia was not pressuring us to be on time at all, but giving us little updates on how far we are along. And I realized, holy, she had posted another question a while ago, but I was busy listening to you, Gitz, so I missed it. But it was around what needs to happen, and I think we're kind of walking in that direction right now, is what needs to happen in order before reconciliation can start, and also what does reconciliation even look like? And so before reconciliation can start is that truth piece. Like, it's just, reconciliation is a buzzword, and I don't know about other like public sectors, but in the education sector, it is a buzzword, and it's always like, how do we do reconciliation? How do we do reconciliation? Well, last time I checked, it's the truth and reconciliation, and the truth hasn't even started to be wide known. There are certain groups of people that know truths, but it hasn't gotten out there, and I don't think we can even, for me personally anyways, the word reconciliation actually makes me angry sometimes. Because I feel like it's an excuse to stop seeing the truth, to stop having to hear the truth. Okay, we're done. We've heard enough truth. Let's go reconcile now, is how it comes across. So for me, what needs to happen is truth. And I think what needs to happen is sovereignty over our nations, and having our own governance systems back, and being able to live in that way before we can even talk about reconciliation. And I know some would say that is reconciliation, but I don't think we can talk reconciliation until we have our sovereignty over all of these things we've talked about. I'm not sure where you're at with that, Gitz, but.
No, I mean, sovereignty is a really great step. We need, for us that had signed treaties, we need to go back to treaties, and we need to get rid of the Union Act. We need to be the architects of that, though. It's Indigenous folks, and not just the ones that are going to agree with you, not the Candace Owen kind of Indians. Like, we actually need legitimate, authentic, intellectual, emotional, spiritual Indigenous folks that are at the forefront. Like Russ Daibo could give you a roadmap to reconciliation, what that would actually look like. Pam Palmater could give you a roadmap of reconciliation. And every nation across Canada would give you their own unique answer, because there's no one size fits all. You're literally dealing with your neighbors, and it can't continue the way that it's right now. We can't still live under the guise of the Indian Act. Apologies without an action behind them are useless. They're just used to quell. They're just used as a manipulative tactic to, get you to stop saying what you're saying, stop speaking your truth, and stop living your truth. But yeah, for me, like, getting rid of the Indian Act would be such a positive for us, as like the Blackfoot Confederacy would be disassembling the Indian Act. It would look different. The Haudenosaunee would have a different idea of what that would look like. And what self-determination, like you were saying, how that applies is that, like, oh, okay, this is what they're going to do now. That's self-determination. The nation itself is going to pull it apart. And what you'll find is a whole spectrum of Indigenous folks. You'll find people who will have these solutions, but you also find some of these nations will be more accommodating to colonizers and living in the colonial, like a colonial structure, that will want pipelines through their lands, and that's totally up to them with what they want to do. But we need to be able to like provide the space, which hasn't happened yet. All these things that are happening right now with Indigenous folks generally happen through coercion. So pipelines go through, we'll promise jobs. You have no jobs right now, we'll promise jobs. You know, you want your child to have better care. Well, you have to give your kid up into, you have to give your kid into care to get better care. These are all coercive tactics. If you give the nations, you return the lands to the people, and you allow them and acknowledge their self-determination, their sovereignty, we will see like a better Canada. We will see a better nation, and healthier nations growing from this. But it all has to come from this dissection and dissolving of the Indian Act. One of the key things that I always talk about is there's a lot of harmful stuff, but over a long enough timeline is the blood quantum, which isn't an Indigenous ideology. That's a really Eurocentric ideology, like a pure blood. That's not an Indigenous concept. Pure blood's going back to the monarchy. That's why the cousins all marry each other to keep the royal bloodline. That's why Prince Charles looks the way he does, because all messed up. That's just marrying his cousins too many times. With us, nation members were people who were part of the nation, adopted our way of life, and lived it. And you could be any color. You could be from any part of the world, but you come in, you learn our language, you learn our ways of being, and you carry yourself as a Six of Gates to be person. You're that person. That we'd see you, that we wouldn't see the color. We would see that you're a good member, a good human being contributing. But I could talk about blood quantum is that I'm 50% Blackfoot, 50% Dene from my mom and my dad's side. To the eyes of the government. My child, my daughter, her mom is half Métis, half white. So the blood quantum then becomes for my child, 25% Blackfoot, 25% Dene, 50% her mom, which is 25% Métis, 25% white. My daughter has a child, and if it's not a Blackfoot or a Dene, her child is my grandchild, if I live long enough, will be no longer status. The whole idea for blood quantum, colonization is a long game. It's not one that they want to win in the next few years. They're looking at generations, but we're actually at this generational break now. Within a couple generations, we're not going to have Indigenous folks that qualify for blood quantum. Why I bring this up is you could be Blackfoot, living a Blackfoot life, thinking as a Blackfoot person or a Six of Gates to be person, but if your blood quantum is under what the government considers, you're no longer that. So if there's no longer any quote unquote blood quantum Blackfoots, then why are they holding the lands? Who are they holding the lands for? If in the eyes of the government, you are no longer Blackfoot, they don't have to hold the lands for anybody else. Then they'll take the lands back and all the resources that are there too.
Well,
that is a long game for the blood quantum.
The blood quantum gets so frustrating because there's many of us that are more than one nation that we come from, right? And the way the Canadian government looks at it on top of that is if part of your bloodline is from a nation that's on the state side of the border, that Indigenous blood is not counted as Indigenous blood by the Canadian government. And so if you are half from the States and half from Canada in the sense of where your nations are from, and then there's any non-Indigenous person that mixes in with that, your child automatically is not Indigenous because you no longer are 50%, even though you can be like, it's ridiculous. Your blood quantum only counts if your nation is above that parallel, right? And again, it's all about, there's so many of us that would be from a nation across the border.
And Blackfoots themselves, we're like right on the border, you know?
That's exactly it. That's exactly it, right? And one side of my family's Anishinaabe from Turtle Mountain, which is down in Minnesota. So that side is not considered Indigenous by the Canadian government. Yeah, we have J Treaty. That's about the only thing, but it's not counted in your blood quantum. So
and the J Treaty also has there's a time for that. And when the blood quantum begins to be diluted, that J Treaty is going to be gone as well.
Yes, exactly. And so, yeah, it's my big worry when we start to look at how our nation's having their own self-determination is that it has to be real. It cannot be the Indian Exclusion Council that are making those decisions. We have one chief up here who is amazing. Like he writes the government and tells them what they're doing wrong all the time and demands them tearing down the day schools and tearing down this, and like he's an amazing man. But there's also another chief over here who talks about how horrible his people are and who says if they can't show up to work, then they shouldn't have a job. He doesn't care about their trauma, and things like that, and says residential schools weren't as bad as people say they were. And there's a chief just down the way from me that says those things. So we can't have it be this idea that the Indian Act Chief and Council make these decisions. It has to be the people as a whole.
So, and even the context of a chief and council system that came from the colonizers. The colonizers took our governance system away through the Indian Act and through law and through by force, and then they injected the chief and council system clear across North America, or sorry, clear across Canada. Yeah. America's a little bit different, but for us, that's what they did. They took away our matriarch, they took away our clan mothers, they took away our leaders, our traditional leaders, and they injected this chief and council system in. So when you hear about like millionaire chiefs who are just like exploiting their people, or they're taking handouts from different oil companies, that's not our system. We didn't create that. That exploitation actually comes from the design that the colonizers had, forced onto us. As for that chief, if you want to know who his name is, he's Chief Louis, and he's a terrible human being. He might have done some great stuff for his people, but the idea of that, like, pull yourself up by the bootstrap philosophy, and I'm quoting Martin Luther King here, it's inhumane.
Specifically Clarence Louis. There's actually really good Louis up here.
Oh, there's a good Louis? And then there's his cousin. No, so let's Clarence Louis. So his idea is pulling yourself up by the bootstraps, and his community has a really great place, geography wise. They can create stuff, but that comes at an expense. And when he says, like, if you can't show up on time, then whatever. But a lot of other nations aren't in the same placement geography wise to communities, non-Indigenous communities. And I'm quoting Martin Luther King here when he says it's inhumane to tell any people to pull themselves up by the bootstraps when they don't have any boots at all. And a lot of our nations are struggling with that. You never really hear him talking about the tobacco trade from the Mohawk people, or the Haudenosaunee. And the Haudenosaunee, this is what I mean by like the destruction of our economy. The Haudenosaunee have, they make some, if you smoke, they make some delicious cigarettes. Yeah. And tobacco, commercial tobacco that the world has came from the Haudenosaunee, the original seeds. They traded it. That was our gift to Europe. That was our gift to North America. That was our gift to the world, was tobacco. They have in it a way to grow it, a way to have whatever. And they decided as a nation, or some people within the nation decided, well, let's create a business out of this. So they started growing and manufacturing and selling tobacco. Now, whether or not you want to see that traditional practice or not, it's really not for you to comment unless you're Haudenosaunee. That's not, because that's not your people. And if that's what they're doing to put food on the table, to bring themselves out of poverty, that's totally and entirely up to them. You can have your thoughts, but your thoughts really aren't dictating their choices. Anyways, Canada itself has made the buying and selling of Mohawk tobacco a contraband. So if you're caught buying and selling, or rather selling or transporting this tobacco, what I've been told is that you get a harsher punishment of taking, say, a kilo of their tobacco than a kilo of like cocaine, because they want to cripple the economy.
Absolutely. So it's Kanawaki, the one that has the biggest selling out here. So it has taken over BC in particular for tobacco sales. And the only reason the government wants to stop it is, well, destroy our economies, and also because there's no money going to the Canadian government on the sales of this tobacco. It's cleaner tobacco than what you buy from the stores. It's absolutely ridiculous. But yes, it is listed as a contraband substance, the same as heroin. And if you are caught selling it, it is the same. And so a lot of the sales stay on reserve. You're muted.
Selling it off res is very like, it's a dangerous thing, and you shouldn't do it, and you shouldn't transport it.
Yeah.
If you're buying it on res and you're selling it on res, the laws are a little bit different on the reservation. So if you go to like, a reservation in your community, hopefully that reservation is supporting the Haudenosaunee by selling it.
Yeah, and that's why you can buy them in a lot of the cannabis shops, because the cannabis shops out here are a huge economic piece on reserve. So like I live on what's called the Green Mile, and it's about 15 kilometers of cannabis stores every, I don't know, quarter of a kilometer or so. They sell the Kanawaki cigarettes there because it falls under different, we're under a different set of laws in that sense on what we can sell on reserve and what we can't. But yeah, it's off reserve, and it's the transportation piece is where people are getting really large charges and being thrown in jail for this. And it's absolutely ridiculous. Like, this tobacco is not an illegal substance to begin with. No drug should be illegal substances, in my opinion. Yeah, so this is a big thing in BC, and there is the Kanawaki Reserve is the one that is the big one that they're watching out for. And so if I leave reserve, I'm not bringing a carton of cigarettes with me because I'm not risking it, you know.
But that's the threat. If you go into the States, it's not really that big of an issue. Europe loves these cigarettes. They purchase them in mass quantities and they distribute them and sell them in and around Europe. But again, Canada has this, one is like the motivation of taxes, but also the continuance of destroying our economies. If you go back in time a little bit, we go to the farming systems that they implemented onto us on the reservations. I'll talk about Piikani, my res, I'm talking about Tsuut'ina, I'm talking about all the nations you can find within Treaty 7 and across the plains. When they forced farming on us, when we weren't farmers, we went from our traditional life to farming. We knew we had an intimate relationship with the land, so we could kind of tell, we could forecast the previous year what the next year might look like. And we took to farming because we're adaptive people and we're very intelligent. Our crops grew better than the settlers' crops. And as a result, the settlers would go to the local governments and they would basically cry about how we had this unfair advantage. So the government mandated that we couldn't buy metal tools to garden, so we had to use wooden tools. And then they then dictated that we couldn't use beasts of burden. So you might find some, I gotta find these photos, but you might find some photos of like Indigenous peoples pushing a hoe, and the beasts of burden are actually men and women. And we still had the ability to grow good crops. It just took like a lot longer to do it. And we were still outgrowing the settlers and the farmers that were there. So the settlers, again, complaining to the government, made it illegal for us to take out loans, to purchase farming equipment, and to even sell our, whatever it is that we were growing. Even fertilizer. We couldn't sell fertilizer and we couldn't sell our crops. The deals had to go through the Indian agent, and the Indian agent would say, like, if you are selling or if you're giving them loans, then we're going to charge you. And then he wouldn't make the deals for our crops. So it's like, imagine you like go back in time with like an Xbox One to when Nintendo just hit, and you're trying to sell this amazing piece of tech back in the 80s, and you can like hook everything up, and you have a middle person who just refuses to sell it. So that's what they did to cripple our economy back then. And then when we had some loans prior to the loan ban, we still owed money. So some of these people would lease out their lands, or the Indian agent would just lease out the lands anyways. So we lost mass sections. Cardston itself, which is south of the Bloods, was leased out to the Mormons. I think it was Mormons. It might be Jehovah's Mormons. Yeah. And they, for like 100 years, for like, I think like $5 or something. And then their 100-year lease came up just a few years ago, and they coerced the nation to renegotiate. But that's like where we're talking about the economies now. It's still being perpetuated today. It's still one of those things that are still happening today. And Clarence Louis will never really talk about the tobacco trade. He likes to pat himself on the back. He likes to see himself as the exception. And here's the crazy thing about the Indian Act. The Indian Act is there to break the nations. Individuals can succeed. Individuals can bring a few other individuals, but the nations themselves are still held back by the Indian Act. This is why we need to dissolve it. There's so many issues that come with it. If we dissolve it, if the nations, individual nations dissolve it and create their own solutions, you're acknowledging self-determination, but you're also providing solutions.
Yeah, exactly. And I don't think we can move towards reconciliation until that happens. We can say pretty things like land acknowledgements. We can say we're indigenizing curriculum. We can do these things, but it's not real reconciliation. It's just performative. And it's one of the things I work on with my students is I'm lucky enough to have 36 amazing teenagers with me every day at work. And just this Indigenous youth are so strong and so powerful. But as much as I try to decolonize my classroom and give them that experience, I still have to answer to a Eurocentric form of learning and a Eurocentric curriculum. Even though I created my own curriculum, it still had to fall into the Eurocentric belief system. And so as much as I'm trying, I still have to give a grade at the end. They still have to write a provincial exam on the computer. They still have to do all of these things in a Eurocentric way, and they still have to be graded in a Eurocentric way. And so even within the education system, as much as I am allowed to decolonize, I have. Without self-determination, we can't fully decolonize any of these systems. Until we can take our education on ourselves and out of the public school system, we can't have self-determination. And so I think reconciliation happens. I don't know. I think it happens when we have decolonized, and then we can figure out how to all live in a way that is reconciled, because we have been able to become healthy communities again.
So like land acknowledgements or land back, which is the solution?
Land back.
Land back.
100%. I teach people how to write land acknowledgements. One of the things I do, and I always start with saying, if you're doing a land acknowledgement but you're not an activist, stop saying it. Like,
100% agree. I'll add this one last thing. Your guilt doesn't do anything for us. Like, I don't. If you want to apologize, like, I don't care. I'm honestly saying this. Like, it doesn't give my land back. Doesn't give us our kids back. Feel bad if you want to feel bad, but realize it doesn't do anything for anybody. Like, it doesn't do anything for you, and it doesn't do anything for the person you're apologizing to. And when you can move beyond that, you start looking at actions and things you can actually do. Most of these things are to support the people that are on the ground, and that's what you need to be focusing on. So if I'm looking at you here, again, if you can listen to my voice, if you have a choice between buying my book, Secret of the Stars, or giving money to the Wet'suwet'en First Nation, the Wet'suwet'en Checkpoint, give it to the Checkpoint. If you have the opportunity between giving my money, buying my book, or giving it to something like the Indigenous Climate Action or the Indigenous Environmental Network, I would say hold on and then give it to the Tiny House Warriors. I would say do what you can to drive to these areas, if you can, if you're within proximity, and go listen to these people and see the best way that you can help them. And they will tell you, and they will give you solutions and strategies. You don't need to think of these things. All you need to do is go there. Don't go there with some like idea where you can save Indigenous folks, because we don't need another white savior. We just need your support. You come to these areas, if they welcome you in, great. Listen to them. That's all you really need to do, is just listen and back our play.
you don't even have to show up. You can email. Wet'suwet'en have email to send to Tiny House Warriors have an email to send to, ask them what they need. Because one thing, like, I know Fairy Creek has done some amazing things stopping what's happening at Fairy Creek, but it's also been just taken over by people who are not all welcome there. Some are, absolutely, not everyone. So shoot an email, say, hey, what do you need? Do you need me to show up? Do you need me to send money? Do you need me to send resources? Ask what they need. Only bring what they ask for, not anything that they don't ask for, because people have shown up with crap that ends up, then they have to figure out how to get rid of it. So reach out to those communities, ask if they want bodies on the ground. Right now with COVID, Wet'suwet'en is a high risk area. All of northern BC is, because of the healthcare resources are crap. My daughter's a nurse for Northern Health, so please make sure that you're welcome there before you show up.
Yeah,
it can be an absolute disaster if you're not. So, but yeah, reach out through email, through Facebook. They have Facebook pages. Ask what they need and do it.
yeah. So I guess we're moving on to questions.
Yeah, I'm just gonna slide back in here.
Julia?
Thank you for all of that. There's one question already, but before that, just to give everyone a second to send in your questions if you have them. I have two things. The first one is, and I should have said this at the beginning, I tried a new ticket host, show pass. 2 or 3 people, your process did not go through. I tried to contact you, show pass won't let me. So if you check your credit card statement and you donated and you still want to donate, please hit me up. If you don't, if you watch this and you were like, nope, then don't. That was a joke. It was a bad joke. But yeah, someone donated a pretty hefty amount of money and it didn't go through. So thank you to whoever you are, but please hit us up. The second part is when we were doing the first land acknowledgement, I'm using someone else's Zoom. Shout out to the Live Foundation, Lloydminster and Vermilion for Equity, and they came in during the beginning of the first land acknowledgement. So they'd like me to apologize for popping on the screen for a brief second. So that all being said, the first question is from Morgan. Some First Nations people say they can't get rid of the Indian Act because it protects land rights. How do treaties long broken by one side protect anything?
Well, that within the treaties, they protect the land. So like you need, when you look at self-determination of the people, it's the ability to actually say no to development and say no to whatever is going on for them to take autonomy for their lands. There's been, the Indian Act stops us and prevents us also from protecting the land, which is why the pipeline's going through, and that's why they're being forcibly removed in Wet'suwet'en territory. You know, the trains that have gone through our system, through our reservations, they want to put a highway, they can do whatever they want with or without the Indian Act, but the Indian Act gives them more power and more strength. These nations and these people have allowed themselves to believe that the treaties have been long since broken, and they are allowing themselves to see that the treaties have been disempowered. And that goes through conditioning, generational conditioning from the colonizers to look at themselves and look at the treaties that were signed as less than. But if we actually dissolve these, and I don't think it'll happen overnight, but if there was one nation that could actually do it, I mean, it would probably be Ganawage, honestly. It'd be probably one of the Mohawk nations out east that would do it first. You would see solutions that would come from this. But the government itself is terribly afraid of a reality and a world without the Indian Act, because the power then comes back to the people. The power then comes back to the Indigenous folks, where it's like, you know what? We're going to defend our lands however we want now. We can call the police on these invaders. We can call the police on the police. We can call our own tribal police now to go and protect our lands forcefully if necessary. And the going back to the treaties allows us to use any means necessary to protect our lands, but also the colonizers have to abide by it. And they also have to act forcefully to protect the lands as well.
And I think looking at in BC, where so much of our land isn't treated, we go back to, I hate to go back to this, but the proclamation, Royal Proclamation, right, 1763, that says if we have not signed treaty, then it's still our land. There's a lot of garbage in that proclamation, but in it also guarantees our sovereignty over our land until such time that treaty is made. And so for those of us who are not on treated land, it would fall back to the 1763 once we get rid of the Indian Act.
And they can go and remove people, even though there's a Royal Proclamation, they can go and remove people because of the Indian Act.
Yes, yeah, exactly. So the elimination of the Indian Act takes us back, like you said, gets to treaties on treated land and proclamation on non-treated land. And the proclamation makes it so that Crown cannot enter our territory without agreement.
And that agreement would look so cool if that actually happened. I would love to go out there and see how your people negotiate agreements like that from a Jewish perspective. And I would be an observer. You know,
yeah, and unfortunately, some of the agreements that are being made currently are from a non-traditional perspective with Indian Act chiefs, right? So the nation is giving up their treaty rights, or sorry, their status rights, basically signing them over, which worries me because I don't think it's under the right, for the right reasons. So basically we'll have an entire nation that doesn't fall under status, which in my world is amazing because it would be living our way how it is meant to be lived. But the way it's panning out, that is not what it is. It's money being handed over to specific individuals so that the rest of the community loses any of their rights.
The second question that came in was wondering if either of you had seen the debate on CTV between, I'm going to say these people's names wrong, Pam Palmater and Alice Ross. And if so, what was your take on the position of Alice, who immaturely talked over Pam repeatedly and said the only way to bring his people out of poverty is to allow the pipeline through?
that guy's lost his mind.
Yeah, I will say I did not watch that, partly because I just don't have TV, but I can imagine it, and I would make me angry because Pam is amazing and Alice is not.
If you would just listen, I don't think this is too far of a reach to say, but I think if he just listened to a woman once in his life, he might be better off. And if he was actually just to listen to Pam, he would definitely be way better off. If his mindset is the only way we can make money is through the exploitation of our lands, the exploitation of our people, then he's lost himself. Because there is different ways to be on this earth, and he forgets how his people were at one time. But there's a lot of lucrative deals that he would, if he was in leadership, or maybe he sides with leadership, or maybe he's in the pocket of the colonizers and the invaders. There's a lot of lucrative like side deals they do. And you know, maybe just like sucking on that teat of the colonizers. But if he would just actually listen to her and empower her and uphold her, you know, he would see the world in a bigger view, and he would see multiple options for his people to get out of poverty. He would see multiple ways to build a beautiful world, especially now that we're now in the phase of climate catastrophe. You know, we're seeing it happen clear across the planet. We're in this phase, and he's still sucking on that colonial teat of like, it has to be resource extraction, has to be land exploitation for us to get out. I mean, it reminds me of that like Dave Chappelle joke. The only way kids out of the ghetto can get out is by like rapping or dealing crack. And it's like the only way for us to get out of our poverty is to just like pipelines through. And that's not the reality. We are adaptive people. We're inventive people. And it's really, he's only just stunting his own people. He's just putting so many limitations on them. Guy's fucking lost.
I think that was all the questions. That is all the questions. If you two have any final words that you'd like to share with everybody before I close it down.
I spoke a lot, so I'll just make this quick. We are in such a traumatic time with COVID, with the climate collapse happening around us. I'm not one of those people that's going to say like, oh, Mother Earth is just going to take care of everything. I think we can actually kill this planet. I really fully believe we can actually kill this planet. We're killing the planet right now. It's showtime here on Mother Earth, and there is no next act. And so if you're watching this, you really either have to prepare for the end and the mass slaughter of all people, or you get behind the backs of those and you support those that are on the front lines right now. That's including the tiny house warriors. So if you eat salmon and you love it, you better be supporting them. You know, the Wet'suwet'en checkpoint, Land Back Lane, Oak is going to kick off again because I know that they're going to be expanding that golf course. Any kind of language retention program, the Freedom School out of Akwesasne, there's all these different pockets of resistance, which is just our way of life. And if you can connect with those people and you can help those people, then you should. By all means, that's something that you should 100% do, because there is no second act after this. This is it. We are literally careening off the edge.
Yeah, I think Gitz made the final words perfect. It's about Mother Earth, and everything we do needs to be in order to protect her and make sure that there's not complete destruction in our lifetime, because I think it is within our lifetime. Support those who are on the front lines, be on the front lines. Please stop trying to take over the front lines. Listen to our Indigenous leaders who are out there. Listen to the tiny house warriors. And I suddenly forgot her name, up in Wet'suwet'en territory, who she's been leading the way for the last, who knows, too long. I mean, the Wet'suwet'en, these conversations have been going on since the 90s around this pipeline up there, in case people aren't aware. They have been actively living, the Wet'suwet'en have been actively living on their land and asking the pipelines not to come on there since the 90s. This isn't a new movement, and people need to recognize this isn't a new movement. This is preservation, and start listening to the Indigenous leaders who are out there on the front lines, doing the work, putting their lives in danger, and being arrested by the RCMP on a daily basis. So yeah, I'm with Gitz on that. Frida, thank you, Gitz. Frida is amazing. I idolize her. I probably shouldn't idolize someone, but I do idolize Frida.
Yeah. Again, we'd all be better off if we listened. We just listened. Yeah. And a lot of these, movements really begin at the heart with women. You know, Indigenous women, Black women, they're often the heart and the start of all of these movements.
Sorry. One more question did come in. Just quickly, and I think this person might have came in, but they asked, did they talk about the oil companies that are asking for blood quantum? We didn't, and I didn't know.
They can go fuck themselves.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's I guess a Vice article on it. Pipeline company wants land defenders to prove they're Indigenous. Gross.
Yeah, I mean, fuck them, all of them. That is a Eurocentric idea. It's not one of ours. Again, I'll say it again. Blackfoot people, Siksikaitsitapi people, we married out. We went to the nations, we took wives, brought them back to our nation, or we went to their nation. And I'm not talking about other Blackfoot nations. I'm talking about the Lakota, Dakota, the Cheyenne, the Crow, the Dene, the people in the north, the people to the west of us. We would go take a wife, bring them back, or we would go and join their nation. Blood quantum, that is a European concept. They're applying these European concepts in a very colonial practice. They want blood quantum They can all go fuck themselves.
Yes, definitely. And yeah, I guess just in closing, like if Canada wanted to do any better, they would be. There would be clean water everywhere. There wouldn't be the federal government still fighting survivors in court. I have no words for that. Even like when John Crechet was the Minister of Indigenous Affairs, his department received complaints, and now he's coming out and saying, "Oh, I've never heard of this," even though the residential schools were open while he was in power. It seems like they're just ignoring the problem. I firmly believe that they were aware of the problem, because if they weren't, then that's some different shit. And yeah, if people wanted to fix it, it would be fixed. But ignoring the problem has gotten us to this point, I think, in the last few generations, or at least purposeful miseducation has got us to this place of ignorance where we can just allow and not even notice or see a genocide happening. And I just really want to implore everyone watching this to try and talk to your friends and family about this. You might be surprised by the reactions that you get. Just, you can bring them back to this. We're going to put it on YouTube. They have some other talks, Stacey and Gitz, on these similar topics. They're all going to be on the YouTube. Just and if all else fails, then you will see the problem, I guess. So thank you again, and have a good night, everyone.
Then lived.